The flames snapped and hissed, a lonely sound in the deep, dark quiet of the mountain. He stirred the embers with a long branch, watching the sparks fly up like angry stars into the blackness. The crackle was the only voice in the stillness, until it wasn't. His hand froze. A shape had just crossed the firelight, a shadow stretching long and thin across the dirt, like the night itself had decided to stand up and walk. He lifted his head, slow. His dark eyes narrowed under the brim of his old hat. And there she was, a young woman stumbling into the circle of light. Her dress was ripped at the bottom, torn from running through the brush. Her breath came in ragged gasps, like she'd been running for miles and miles and had only just now stopped. In the flickering orange glow, a plain iron ring on her hand gleamed. A cruel, simple band of metal that told a story far worse than the one on her exhausted face. His voice broke the silence. It was low and steady, a sound that seemed to come from the stones of the mountain itself, a truth that had been waiting a long, long time to be spoken. "I've dreamed this shape before," he said. His gaze wasn't on her face, but on the outline of her shadow dancing against the trees behind her. She froze solid, clutching a small bundle to her chest as if his words were a physical blade. Her eyes were wide, glistening, caught somewhere between running again and collapsing right where she stood. "Stay back," she whispered, her voice shaking like a leaf. But the fear in it wasn't just of him. You could hear it plain as day. It was fear of the world she'd just run from, fear of the hands that had forced that ugly iron ring onto her finger, fear of the man whose name was attached to it, a claim that had chased her all the way up into these unforgiving mountains. The mountain man didn't get up. He just set the branch aside and leaned forward a little, the fire painting his weathered face in shades of orange and black. He was a man who knew visions. He was a man who knew loneliness. But the sight of her, right there, right now, made something heavy stir deep inside his chest. Something that felt older and heavier than any memory he had. The silence stretched out between them, pulled tight. The only sounds were the whip and crackle of the flames and her own unsteady breathing. She glanced down at the ring on her hand, a quick, hateful look, as though the metal itself was choking her. She balled her hand into a fist, trying to hide it, but the fire caught it again, making it glimmer, like a link in a chain attached to her very soul. He just watched her, his face calm, his words repeating softly, more to himself than to her. "Yes," he murmured, "I've dreamed this shape before." She shuddered, torn between disbelief and a strange, powerful pull she couldn't understand or name. For a single heartbeat, the night seemed to lean in closer, as if the fire itself was demanding to know what invisible string tied these two strangers together. "Why would you say that?" she snapped. Her voice was sharp, trying to be strong, but a tremor ran through it, betraying just how close she was to shattering into a million pieces. The firelight caught the wet tracks of tears on her cheeks as she glared at him across the flames. "You don't know me. You can't," she added, her fist tightening over the iron ring, as if hiding it could somehow erase the reason she was running and the shame that was burning her alive. He didn't flinch from her anger. He didn't rise to her defiance. He just tilted his head a little, his eyes reflecting the fire like two hot coals. His words came out slow, measured, as if he were carving them from the mountain stone around them. "Because I have seen you," he said, "in dream and in shadow. And now you stand before my fire, the same shape, the same weight I could never forget." She shook her head, a violent, desperate motion. She took a step back, making her shadow stretch even longer across the dirt, as if putting a few more feet between them could break the spell of his words. "Dreams are nothing but smoke," she whispered, but her voice cracked on the words. She wanted to believe it so badly, Because if she didn't, if she accepted what he was saying, it meant that fate itself had dragged her to this specific spot, in front of this specific man. A low buzz started up in the trees, just the sound of night insects, but it felt like the whole forest was listening, passing judgment. She took a shaky breath and spat the next words out bitterly. Men only dream of one thing, owning, taking. So you tell me, mountain man, which one are you? He leaned forward again, just slightly. His gaze was rock steady. His voice was even quieter now, but it held a certainty that shook her to her core. Not a man who takes, he said, a man who waits. He looked from her face to the fire and back again. The fire brought you here, not me. The sheer calmness of his answer was more unnerving than any threat could have been, and she felt the ring on her finger burn with a sudden cold, as if reminding her she was already claimed, already bound to a man whose absence was somehow more terrifying than his presence ever was. She lifted her hand a little, the dull metal glinting, before she quickly tucked it back into the folds of her shawl. But it was too late. The mountain man's eyes had flicked to it, just for a second. But in that second, she saw a spark of recognition. He knew. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Panic began to rise up in her throat like bile. He had seen too much. He knew too much. She had to run. She had to get away. But her legs wouldn't obey. They felt rooted to the ground, held there by the strange, heavy gravity of his stillness. "Keep your fire," she managed to mutter, forcing steel into her trembling voice. "I want no part of your dreams." She turned, ready to plunge back into the darkness, but his voice followed her, as steady and solid as the mountains themselves. "And still," he said, "your shadow remains." Her breath hitched in her throat. His words tangled with the memories she had run so hard to escape. She looked down at her own hand, at the place where the iron ring pressed against her skin. It felt cold, even in the heat of the fire. It felt heavy, as if it wasn't forged from metal, but from all the tears she wasn't allowed to cry. She remembered the exact moment it was shoved onto her finger. Her family's voices echoing around her like a death sentence. "Better a cruel husband than no bread at all," her father had said, not looking her in the eye. "Better a roof over your head than disgrace on our family," her mother had added, her face a mask of hard duty. She had begged them. She had pleaded, her hands shaking, telling them she would work her fingers to the bone, that she would rather starve than be bound to that man. But their faces had turned to stone. They had turned away from her, and the ring had slid onto her finger like a shackle locking into place. The cruelty of it burned deeper than any brand. It wasn't just that they had silenced her voice. They had silenced the memory of her own grandmother, who had once held her as a child and told her that love was a thing to be chosen, not commanded. Tears pricked at her eyes now, hot and sharp. She clenched her fist tighter, feeling the edge of the iron band cut into her palm. A fierce whisper rose up inside her mind, a promise she had made to herself in the dark. "I will not wear this forever. I will not die in his house." The mountain man's gaze never left her face. It was steady, unblinking, and it made her tremble because it felt like he could see right through her skin, right into her soul, and read every single secret thought she was trying so desperately to hide. "That ring," he said softly, his voice barely a murmur above the crackling fire. "It weighs on you like a chain." The words weren't aimed at her. It was as if he was speaking to the night itself. But they cut through her defenses as if he had reached right into her chest and squeezed her heart. She shook her head, a sharp, angry motion. Fury flashed through her tears. She would not let this stranger name the poison she had been forced to swallow. "It is nothing," she said, her voice harsh and brittle. She clutched her small bundle against her ribs like a shield. "A circle of iron cannot break me." But the lie tasted sour on her tongue. Her knees felt weak with the crushing truth that it already had. She turned her back on him, away from the fire, staring into the black wall of trees. She wished the night would just swallow her whole, shadow and all, and leave nothing for his knowing eyes to see. But the fire snapped behind her, loud and sudden. She heard him stir. His voice came again, low and certain, impossible to ignore. "Dream or not," he said, "that shadow will follow you until you choose where it belongs." His words sank into her deeper than all the jeers of her family, deeper than the threats of the man she was running from, because they carried no cruelty, no force. They only carried the unbearable weight of a choice, the one thing her own kin had stolen from her. And now this stranger was trying to give it back. Smoke curled up from the embers in thin gray ribbons, carrying the scent of pine and ash into the air. The night was so still it felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. The small circle of firelight felt like the only place in the whole world where life still dared to exist. Beyond its warm glow, the trees stood like silent black judges, their branches stark against a pale dusting of stars. The crackle of burning wood was the only sound between them, except for the ragged sound of her own breathing. She sat rigid on a log at the very edge of the light, her bundle clutched to her chest like a lifeline. The iron ring pressed hard into her palm, a constant cold reminder that she had no right to be here, no right to be free. Across from her, the mountain man crouched near the flames. His rough features were lit in flickers of orange and gold. His eyes didn't hold suspicion or cruelty. They held a deep, unnerving steadiness that unsettled her more than any malice ever could. His silence was heavier than any words. It pressed in on her, forcing the questions she'd been running from to the surface. Why had her feet carried her to this fire? Why hadn't she just kept running, deeper into the dark? Why did his voice still echo in her ears like a half-forgotten song, a promise she desperately wanted to refuse? A branch snapped somewhere in the trees. The sound was sharp, loud against the hush of the night. She stiffened instantly, her eyes darting to the deep shadows beyond the fire. She clutched her bundle so tight her knuckles turned white. The mountain man shifted. His hand moved, resting loosely near the handle of a heavy axe that was propped against a stump. But he didn't get up. He just listened, his body as still as the stone around them. The silence returned, heavier now, and watchful. She let out a slow, shaky breath, her shoulders slumping, but her heart refused to calm down. It was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. My grandfather, Elias Redfeather, used to tell stories by his own fire, and he'd say, "I've carried many tales in my heart, tales of widows and runaways, and men who lived with only fire for company. But in this one story," he'd say, "the fire itself seemed to be listening, as if it knew that fate had pulled two strangers into its light for a reason." The fire popped loudly, sending a shower of bright orange sparks leaping toward the sky. She flinched, and her hand jerked free from her bundle. The iron ring caught the light again, glinting for a moment before she could snatch it back. His gaze flicked to it, and then back to her face. He didn't say a single word, but she could feel the weight of his thoughts pressing against her, as real as a hand on her shoulder. The ring, the fire, the dream. They were all threads, threads of a story she never wanted, but one she could no longer escape. The night itself seemed to lean in closer, waiting, waiting to see what she would do next. "You carry a weight that was never meant for you," the mountain man said suddenly. His deep voice broke through the quiet like a stone dropped into a still pond. She startled, her hand flying to her other, clutching the iron ring as if he had just tried to reach across the fire and rip it from her finger. "You don't know me," she shot back, her words sharp, but her voice was trembling. "You don't know what it cost me to wear this." His eyes flickered to the flames, and for a moment the fire danced in their dark depths. When he looked back at her, his voice was quieter, but as steady as a mountain stream. "I know more than you think." He paused, letting the silence hang between them. "That ring on your hand," he said slowly. "It was hammered from ore I pulled from this very earth not 5 years ago. I felt its weight in my own palms, heavy and raw. And in the nights that followed, when I slept, I dreamed of its shape. And in the dream, I saw you." The words hit her harder than a physical blow, harder than the cruel words of her family, harder than the lonely silence of the road she had fled. Her breath caught in her lungs, stolen, as if the very air had turned against her. "No," she whispered, shaking her head again, a frantic denial. But her knees felt weak, watery, under the absolute certainty in his tone. "No, iron is iron. It's just metal. It binds, it scars. It isn't a vision. It's not fate." The mountain man leaned forward, his shadow growing larger behind him. His voice was firm, leaving no room for doubt. "I bled to bring that metal into the light," he said, his voice dropping lower. "My own blood stained the rock it came from, and in the nights after I dreamed of a shadow who carried its weight, a shadow running from a pain I could feel in my own bones. Tonight, that shadow crossed my fire. And now, standing here, I see the truth of it." He locked his gaze with hers, and she felt pinned in place. "You were never meant to wear it as a shackle," he said. "You were meant to decide what it will become." She trembled, a violent shudder that shook her whole body. Fury rose up inside her, mingled with a grief so deep it felt like it would drown her. "It was forced on me," she cried, her voice breaking. "My family pressed it onto my hand and told me that obedience was the only way to survive. How could it be meant for anything else?" Her tears were burning now, her words coming out jagged and broken. She pressed the ring so hard against her skin that a sharp pain flared up her arm, as sharp as a knife's edge. The silence of the forest seemed to deepen, as if the ancient trees themselves were straining to hear her answer. "My grandfather Elias would often say that some people believe the earth gives up its iron to make chains. Others say it is for making swords. But every now and then, he'd whisper, it yields a single, simple band of metal. A band that isn't meant for war or for prison. It's meant to test a soul, to see if love can be chosen, or if it can only be endured." Her chest ached with an unspeakable sorrow. The mountain man's gaze held hers, as unyielding as the granite cliffs around them. It was as if he wouldn't allow her to look away from the terrible, beautiful truth he had just laid at her feet. The fire popped again, sending another shower of sparks leaping up between them. And she realized with a cold, terrifying shudder that his words had just bound her to him more tightly than the iron ring ever could, because they gave her back the one thing she thought had been stolen from her forever, a choice. And just as that thought settled in her heart, another sound shattered the night. Hoofbeats, pounding against the hard-packed earth, sudden and sharp, breaking through the stillness like thunder rolling down the side of the mountain. She jerked to her feet, clutching her bundle to her chest, her eyes flying wide with pure animal terror. From the blackness of the tree line, 3 riders burst into the clearing. Their lanterns swung wildly, casting monstrous dancing shadows. Their faces were half hidden in the gloom, but their voices were cruel and unmistakable as they yanked their horses to a halt at the edge of the firelight. "There she is!" one of them shouted, and the iron in his tone was colder and harder than the ring on her hand. Her pulse roared in her ears, so loud it drowned out the hiss of the flames. Every single instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to disappear into the woods. But her legs wouldn't move. They were locked in place, rooted to the spot, as if the earth itself had betrayed her and turned to stone. In a single, fluid motion, the mountain man rose to his full height. His broad shoulders blocked her from view, casting his own long shadow over her, a shield of darkness. He took one deliberate step, positioning himself squarely between her and the riders. His hand closed firmly around the smooth wooden haft of his axe. He didn't raise it. Not yet. But the quiet, solid weight of his stance carried more of a warning than 1,000 shouted threats ever could. One of the riders leaned forward in his saddle, his face twisting into a sneer in the fire's glow. "She belongs to another," the rider snarled. "Promised, paid for, and bound by that ring on her finger. You've got no right to her, mountain man." Her breath caught in her throat. The words were like a knife, twisting in the wound her own family had carved into her soul. Shame burned hot in her cheeks, so hot it felt like the whole mountain, the whole world was staring at her, judging her. But the mountain man didn't even flinch. His voice rumbled out, low and dangerous, like the sound of distant rock breaking loose and starting an avalanche. "A ring forged in iron," he said, his voice clear and cold, "cannot buy a soul." The riders shifted uneasily in their saddles. Their horses stamped and snorted, their nervous energy filling the small clearing. The swinging lanterns cast wild, frantic shadows all around them. My grandfather Elias used to say that there are two kinds of men in this world. There are the men who trade women like their cattle, and then there are the men who stand like an old oak tree against a hurricane, daring the world to try and cut them down. This tale, he'd say with a grim nod, belongs to the second kind. She felt her knees start to buckle. Fear was a clawing, desperate thing at her throat. And yet, underneath the terror, a tiny flicker of something else stirred. Relief. Sharp, fierce, and completely unbidden. Relief at the solid wall of defiance that had risen between her and the chains that had hunted her down. But the riders weren't giving up. The leader sneered again, spitting onto the ground near the fire. "Step aside, mountain man. She'll go back with us one way or another. Either walking or after we put you in the ground." The threat hung in the air like a hangman's noose. The flames snapped high between them, a wall of fire separating two worlds. She clutched the iron ring so hard she felt her own nails dig into her palm, drawing blood. She was torn between the absolute terror of being dragged back to that man, back to that life, and the terrifying, impossible hope that maybe, just maybe, she had finally found someone who would not let her be taken. Her chest tightened until every breath felt like it might be her last. The words clawed their way up her throat before she could swallow them back down, raw and jagged in the firelit clearing. "I can't go back," she cried, her voice trembling but loud enough for every man to hear. "But I can't go forward either. Chains bind me no matter where I turn." Tears streaked through the dust on her cheeks. She was gripping the iron ring so tightly now that its sharp edges were cutting deep into her palm. Warm, wet blood mixed with the metal's cold bite. "This band was forced on me," she sobbed, the words tumbling out in a rush of pain and grief. "Pressed onto my finger until I thought I would choke on its weight. If I keep it, I am his property. But if I cast it away, I am nothing. A woman with no family, no home. Nothing." The admission tore her apart, leaving her shaking and exposed in the firelight. For a long moment, the only sounds were the restless snorting of the horses and the angry hiss of the flames. The riders sneered. Their leader leaned forward again, a cruel, triumphant grin spreading across his face. "You hear that? She admits it herself. She's bound. Best you step aside, mountain man, before her shame spreads to you." The mountain man did not move. His broad frame was still, solid, like a wall of ancient oak. His eyes weren't on the riders. They were fixed on her. And when he spoke, his voice carried no anger, no force. It carried a steady, unbreakable calm that cut deeper than any rage ever could. "Fear," he said, his voice resonating in the quiet clearing, "is a chain sharper than any iron. But hope is heavier still, because it asks you to trust what you cannot see. His words struck her harder than their threats, harder than the ring biting into her flesh. She let out a single sob, fierce and broken. "Hope terrifies me," she whispered, her knees weakening until she thought she would fall. "Because hope can be taken away, I would rather bear the chains I can see than reach for a promise that will only vanish like smoke." My grandfather Elias's voice would always get soft and sad when he reached this part of the story. "I have seen widows," he'd say, "who clutch their grief like it's a suit of armor. I've seen orphans cling to their sorrow like it's a shield, because to them hope feels too fragile, too fleeting. It's a risk they can't afford to take. Yet the bravest souls in all of creation," he'd finish, his voice full of wonder, "are the ones who dare it anyway. The ones who hold out their empty hands and risk losing everything they have for the simple chance of being held." She sank lower, trembling, as the riders shifted their horses restlessly. They were impatient. They were ready to drag her away. And in her heart she knew she couldn't stay here, suspended between terror and a desire so fierce it scared her. The mountain man's shadow fell over her, a comforting weight. His presence was as steady as the stone beneath her feet. And though he hadn't moved an inch, hadn't touched her at all, she felt his words pressing her, pushing her toward a choice she had never, ever been allowed to make for herself. The first gray light of dawn began to creep over the jagged ridgeline. It bled into the clearing, paling the fire until all that was left was thin wisps of smoke curling up from the dying embers. In the new light, the faces of the riders came into sharper view. Hard lines, tight jaws, eyes that gleamed not with duty, but with simple, ugly greed. Their horses stamped, snorting clouds of white breath into the chill morning air. The iron ring on her hand glimmered dully, no longer catching the firelight as though the day itself was waiting for her decision. She sat hunched on the log, trembling with a bone-deep exhaustion. Her body ached from the miles she had run, from the fear that had been her only companion. But the weight of the men's stares pressed down on her, heavier than hunger, heavier than thirst. The mountain man stood tall at the edge of the fire's circle. His axe hung loosely at his side. His silence was more commanding than any shout. And when the wind shifted, carrying the last cold smell of ash and pine, it felt like the mountain itself was standing there with him. "We're done waiting," the leader barked, his teeth bared in a snarl. "Hand her over now, or we'll take her from your corpse." The threat cracked through the clearing, as sharp and final as a rifle shot. She flinched, clutching her bundle tighter, the ring biting deep, deep into her bleeding skin. My grandfather's voice would always linger in the quiet after that line, soft yet unyielding. "I have known many mornings," he'd say, "mornings where the rising sun brought comfort and hope. And I have known mornings where it only served to reveal the cruelty of men who were too eager to claim what was never theirs to begin with. This," he'd sigh, "was one of the latter. And every dawn that followed for those people would carry its echo." Her throat burned with unshed tears. She lifted her face, her eyes raw and red from a sleepless night of terror. And for the first time she spoke not to the riders who had come to claim her, not to the memory of the man who had forced this band upon her. She spoke to the stranger who stood like a wall of stone between her and the abyss. "If I choose freedom," she asked, her voice cracking, the words trembling in the new light, "will you stand with me? Until the end?" The entire clearing seemed to hold its breath. The mountain man's gaze met hers. It was steady, unflinching, and though he had not yet said a word, the promise she saw in his silent gaze made her pulse thunder louder than the pounding of the horses' hooves. The riders shifted, their patience gone. Their leader raised a gloved hand as if to signal the charge. The morning air turned sharp, thin, cold as a blade pressing down on all of them. The ring cut deeper into her palm, blood against iron. She knew with a terrifying certainty that the moment of choice could not be delayed another second. It was here. It was now. A ring has no worth unless it is freely chosen, the mountain man said. His voice was deep and steady, and it carried across the clearing with such force that even the restless horses stilled. The riders froze where they were, at the edge of the dying fire. The widow's breath caught in her throat. The words struck her like a hammer hitting hot iron, reshaping everything she thought she knew. She clutched her wounded hand even tighter, as if the band might burn straight through her flesh. The leader of the riders spat into the dirt, his sneer twisting into something darker, uglier. That band was paid for, he snarled. It was promised, forged in coin and bargain. She belongs to the man who bought her. The widow's knees trembled. The shame of those words felt heavier than any chains could ever be. But the mountain man did not waver. His frame was a silhouette against the rising sun, as immovable as the mountain at his back. Iron can be traded, he said, his voice ringing with a power that seemed to shake the very ground. Coin can be spent. But no man can own a soul. She is not cattle, she is not property, and no law of earth or sky will ever make it so. His voice cut sharp and clean through the morning air, and my grandfather Elias's reflection on the story would always carry into that silence. There are moments, he'd say, when words weigh more than steel, when a single truth, spoken aloud with a clear heart, is enough to make bad men hesitate before they draw their guns. This was one of those moments. The riders shifted, and for the first time you could see a flicker of unease in their hard faces. But their leader, he wouldn't back down. He pressed on, pointing a gloved finger at the trembling woman. "Look at her," he shouted. "She wears the ring still. She admits the bond. She belongs to him, whether she wants it or not." She flinched, the raw truth of it searing her like a brand. She could feel the band biting into her skin, a shackle carved by her own family's betrayal. Her voice, when it came, was cracked and raw with despair. "Then tell me," she whispered, her voice barely carrying, "what am I if I cast it away? A woman with no name, no place, worth nothing." The mountain man's gaze turned on her then. It was fierce and unyielding. His voice was low, but every single person in that clearing heard it as clear as a bell. "You will be what you decide to be," he said. "Not iron, not bargain, not coin. Choice. That is the only thing that gives a life its worth." His words burned hotter than the rising sun, and for the very first time since it was placed on her finger, she felt the ring grow lighter in her palm, as though it, too, had been waiting for this very moment. The riders scowled, their faces twisting with rage, but none of them dared to move against him yet, because his stance bore the weight of the mountains, and his truth had just cracked the very ground beneath their threats. The widow stared down at the ring in her bloody hand. Her tears blurred its shape, turning the dull iron into a watery gleam. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the final choice now belonged to her, and to her alone. Her tears spilled faster, but they weren't tears of sorrow anymore. They were tears of release. In their burning trail, she felt a lifetime of weight begin to slip from her shoulders. With a deep, trembling breath, she opened her palm and looked at the iron ring, as if seeing it for the very first time. It wasn't just the band her family had forced on her. It wasn't just the proof of her shame. It was a circle, an empty circle, waiting for her voice to give it meaning. Her chest heaved with a great, shuddering sob. She rose slowly from the log, her legs shaking but holding her steady. The crowd of riders leaned forward in their saddles like vultures, hungry to see her collapse. But she didn't collapse. Instead, she lifted her hand high, the simple iron ring gleaming in the first full golden rays of the dawn. And her voice rang out, clear and true through the silent clearing. It was cracked with tears, yes, but it was stronger than it had ever been in her entire life. "I am not his," she declared. "I am not bought." She locked eyes with the leader of the riders. "This ring has no power but the power I give it." Then she turned her gaze to the mountain man, a universe of gratitude in her eyes. "And I choose," she said, her voice ringing with newfound strength, "to give it now." She stepped forward into the circle of his shadow, and with trembling fingers she took the iron band off her finger. It slid off easily, as if it had been waiting for this moment. She pressed it into his broad, calloused palm. His hand closed around it gently, almost reverently, and when his dark eyes met hers, she felt no chains, no bargain, no debt. She only felt the steady, quiet strength of a vow that had been made without words and had already been kept. The riders cursed, a string of foul words that were swallowed by the morning light. Their leader spurred his horse, making it rear up, but it was an empty threat. None of them dared to charge. The mountain man stood with the weight of the mountain behind him, and the truth had already broken their claim more completely than any axe ever could. My grandfather would always pause here and look into the flames of his own fire. "I have seen women walk out of fires," he'd say, his voice soft, "carrying nothing but their scars. But in that one moment, on that one morning, I saw a woman walk into the dawn carrying her own name again, unshackled and unafraid. The woman, no, not a possession, not a runaway, simply a woman." Drew in a long, ragged breath, and then, to her own astonishment, a laugh broke free from her throat. It wasn't a cruel laugh or a hollow one. It was rich and deep and trembling with a relief so profound it was holy. The sound startled even the riders, silencing their final, muttered curses. Because it was not the laugh of shame. It was the laugh of victory, the sound of a spirit, long caged, finally rising into the light. The mountain man let the ring rest in his open palm. He didn't claim it. He didn't put it on. He just held it, as if it were a precious seed waiting for the right soil. And she knew, in that single, silent moment, that freedom didn't mean walking away alone. It meant choosing who you wanted to stand beside. She stepped closer to him, her laughter softening into a smile that reached her weary eyes. The dawn spread like liquid gold across the clearing, washing away the last of the night's cruelty and promising a new day. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted tales from Stories Left Behind. Let me ask you, if you had carried that iron ring, would you have thrown it into the fire or given it as a choice of freedom? Let us know in the comments below.